Thank you so much for joining in, guys. For everyone tuning in, all the speakers, we have some amazing folks with us, and looking forward to some spicy takes on things. The agenda for our spaces, or like just a discussion topic for today, is what's the end game of on-chain interactions going to be, right? Is it chain abstraction? Is it intents? What are they exactly? How are they different? How they alike, right? So we'll get into all of this. But before that, let's maybe do some quick intros, starting alphabetically. Maybe Arjun, you want to go introduce yourself and Connext?
Hi, I'm Arjun. I'm one of the founders of Connext. Connext is a protocol that enables fast interactions between blockchains. Our goal is to try to abstract away the experience of having to interact with many chains. We were kind of some of the first people thinking about this problem, and we were one of the first projects to start experimenting with intent-based interoperability back in like 2021. And have been sort of really trying to do deep thinking around like what it will take to get to the point where as a user, you can just go and use an app and you don't have to think about all of the underlying infrastructure. We can finally realize the like ultimate dream of being able to build on blockchains.
Awesome. Grant, you want to go next and introduce yourself and Essentials?
I'm Grant, head of growth for Essential Declarative, intent-based rollup on Ethereum. We leverage constraints to remove the need for execution and enable developers to build scalable applications that optimize for the best user outcomes.
It's Kevin from Khalani Network. Khalani is the platform for solvers, to build solvers and solver networks. And the way we talk about this is we want to make solvers like apps or DApps, right? Because today they're not, right? So you just build a bot right on the server, and that's a solver. We want to provide a platform to make solvers very similar as DApps, right? So you can just focus on writing software and then deploy to Khalani. And with Khalani, you can collaborate with other solvers to sort of co-propose solutions, and you can delegate operations to like specialists, just the same as Ethereum, for example. Most people just delegate operation of the infrastructure to Infura and other providers. So basically, with Khalani, solvers become applications, right? So you deploy modules to Khalani, and then you just run Khalani node at your solver. So that's Khalani.
Last but not the least, VC, you want to introduce yourself and Socket?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Vaibhav. I also go by VC. One of the founders here at Socket, mostly do tech product engineering research. Kind of like been involved in like the scaling journey since like day one, and what we're doing at Socket. Socket is the first chain abstraction protocol. The goal is we have this new thing called MOFA that allows applications, users, and liquidity to compose across chains in a fashion that feels like complete chain abstraction. You don't feel like you're building on 1,000 rollups, but you get all the benefits of it.
Awesome. So let's dive right in. So I think just before we get started, right? I think like we want to do a quick one-line explainer of what does intent and chain abstraction really mean, right? Like
I can quickly go first about chain abstraction. So the way I like to think about chain abstraction is simply infrastructure that allows users to interact with the block space as a whole without knowing what chain they are specifically interacting with. And that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really well said, right? I'd say just specifically chain abstraction is a vision, right? It's a vision for how this space could work. It's not necessarily a technology, but like a collective of different technologies that can collaborate to like just work together at different parts of the stack to create an experience where as a user, you just really never have to know what chain you're on or have to even think about chains in the first place.
I can go for intents. I'll jump in for a second. So we really think of intents as a primitive that enable a lot of like more advanced on-chain and even off-chain actions. But ultimately, intents are just a user expressed constraint on the end state of a chain. That's to say, effectively, you as a user, when you express an intent, you're saying like, I want this next state update to reflect a specific change for me.
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of expand on that. Fundamentally, I see intents more basically like a mediated pattern, right? So in the context of interactions, then intent is just user asks the agent to carry something for them. And then in the context of protocol design, the protocol developer is building the protocol, assume there are going to be off-chain agents available to help them achieve what they want. I mean, this is not a definition of intents or how intents are formalized in our system and all that. We're not into that. But I think from user point of view, the intent just introduce off-chain agents, right? So from users' point of view, they no longer interact with blockchains directly. They interact first with this agent, like travel booking agent, right? You interact with them instead of the airlines. And then from protocol developers, they assume that there will be existing off-chain agents that are available to help them, um, to define either pricing or MEV and a lot of the off-chain concerns. We see that pattern as intent centric. Yeah.
Yeah, wait. I guess one for folks who are like non-technical, a way that I found seems to really resonate is for intent specifically is to think of something like Uber, where like when you're using Uber today, you're effectively expressing your intent to go be delivered somewhere, and Uber then is running a marketplace where they go and figure out who is the best person to go and solve this intent for you, right? Which driver is close enough to you that can get you from point A to point B at the lowest cost and as quickly as possible. It's like a way to think about it is it's a design pattern where you're paying like service providers to do the thing for you instead of doing it yourself, because doing the thing yourself is just more complicated.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I agree.
Maybe a good analogy about chain abstraction will also help. Arjun, you want to give like an analogy on that as well?
Yeah. Well, a good analogy. So I want to specify these are slightly different in the sense that intents are like a technology, like it's a design pattern and a solution, and then chain abstraction is like a vision, right? It's not like any specific technology, but like a chain abstracted experience. So the Web2 equivalent of a chain abstracted experience, for example, as an analogy, would be like using YouTube. When you use YouTube today and you search for cat videos, in the background, YouTube is going and like searching across this extraordinarily complex distributed database that Google has built. But as a user, you don't need to know about it or care about it at all. And like if you did, you probably wouldn't want to use YouTube. I think we're kind of in the same place right now, where it's like today we sort of expect, we are like, hey, go use this really awesome app that is going to be the future of finance. But in order to do that, you have to go and understand everything about how it's built. And that's obviously nonsense. It's useful for people in the space, but it's nonsense for anybody outside of the space.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that kind of like introduce all of these concepts like chain abstraction and intents is just the increasing number of chains and the increasing complexity of, let's say, cross-chain transactions, for example, right? Like especially that comes in and it just like makes the current world sucky, to say the least, right? So I think like to just start things off and start going deeper, what do you really hate about the current kind of like paradigm with like so much cross-chain interactions and so such sort of like messy UX that exists today along with that? And how does your approach, like this approach to intents or chain abstraction, right, like solve that? So yeah, maybe Kevin, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think in this context, there's too many chains, right? And then this is not, this is a problem for users, obviously. There's a reason that there has to be too many chains because, this is how you get more block space. For Web3 to scale, it's just inevitable, right? But for users, it's just a headache. I have to understand which chain I'm interacting with, wallets and assets. pretty quickly got out of control. I think most people probably have this sort of experience. And for example, like Bitcoin was, a lot of Bitcoin assets were very hot, and to participate in the Bitcoin ecosystem, I think for a lot of people that's like a real pain. You have to understand wallets, you have to understand how to do transactions differently, and so on and so forth. And most people don't even have Bitcoin nowadays. But even sort of from intent point of view, even outside of that complexity, like introduced by multiple chains, there is also complexity introduced by even just having one chain for users. The fact that they have to get gas, right? The fact that they have to, when they operate like a MetaMask, they sign a message. It's an approval thing. Like for users, it doesn't make sense. So we just want to make this as simple as possible for users. Just say what you want, and then we give you a UI confirmed in very declarative language and say, hey, this is what you want, and this is what you will get. This is the guarantee of the outcome of execution. If you're okay with it, click a button, then it's done. It will always guarantee to be done this way, right? So it's very outcome focused for users, and that's really the path towards sort of mass adoption, right? For a lot more people coming to the space.
Since I'm the biggest cross-chain hater, you can find that we have things to say here. I think we've been kind of like building in this like cross-chain environment ourselves at Socket for the last year and a half, almost 2 years now. And what we kind of like realized was, yes, stuff that Kevin mentioned, that there are economical and technical reasons why people will want to kind of like launch their own L2s and L3s. And this is going to kind of like keep happening. Cross-chain, in our opinion, was like a good way to kind of like merge things back together if we had like 15, 20 chains. But as we kind of like are in this world where there are going to be 1,000 rollups at some point, it just does not work. It's just a very low bandwidth connection. One of the other ways to kind of like think about this, or like how we kind of like thought about this on our end, was okay, we are heading into this like modular stack, and what the modular stack does is incentivizes kind of like breaking down things into like multiple layers, right? What happens as a result is each of these layers are controlled by different off-chain entities, right? So let's say there is CowSwap, then there is some like bridging protocol, then there is like a L2 thing. So now you have to kind of like interact with the swapping protocol once, then the bridging protocol once, and then you have to pay gas to the sequencers. So what's really happened is that the modular stack kind of like broke things down into multiple layers. All of these layers are controlled by off-chain entities, and these off-chain entities aren't able to kind of like collaborate. And hence what happens is, as a user, you have to go through all of these things manually. And that's what kind of like makes the cross-chain experience suck so much. And that's what we're trying to do with like Socket and Mofa, is to allow these off-chain entities to kind of like collaboratively produce a block that gets executed on-chain. So these entities can kind of like do things for the end user and give this like chain abstract experience to the end user and the end user. Arjun, do you have a take?
Yeah. I mean, I think that was well said. I totally agree that there's just a lot of these individual operations that we're doing that sort of need to be bundled, and you can bundle them very effectively on a single chain because everything happens synchronously. So you can just write a contract that does all of it all together. But the moment you start introducing asynchrony across chains, now you have to have a user do like, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And people, because every single time you do one of those steps, you're like, oh, I have to pay gas, and I also have to switch my wallet, and I also have, so you're like running through the same cognitive hurdle every single time. I think just to expand on that, there's also one other problem that I kind of see associated with cross-chain today and like the cross-chain world that we live in, which is that it also creates some like perverse incentives where like, if we want this space to work, really, really work, there's not a lot of point in building a custodial world. It just doesn't really make any sense. And yet we are kind of forced into this world where we're like, okay, well, we need to provide a really good user experience. And so whatever transport protocol we're building has to be like super performant, right? It has to be able to make a message pass a message between chains in minutes or seconds. And it needs to do that at like fractions of a penny. But the reality is there is actually no security mechanism out there that can relay messages with that scalability. So you always have this trade-off where it's like, oh, I want to use XYZ transport protocol, right? Like Hyperlane, Layer 0, whatever, in order to build this cross-chain application. But this cross-chain application if I want it to be in any way user friendly, needs to then be like pretty custodial. Like at best, it can be a multi-sig. And then you go and you introduce things like light clients or like shared sequencers or other more sophisticated ways to get Ethereum level security, which is why we built L2s in the first place. When you go and introduce those things, now you're making it more expensive, you're making it slower. I think chain abstraction and the intent thesis more broadly around like how you can kind of abstract away this experience centers around this notion of like, let's separate concerns. So like in the same way that with Ethereum, we kind of separated, L1 is where all the security is. L1 is going to be slow, it's going to be expensive, and to be honest, long term, you shouldn't build on it. You just shouldn't. Like there's no point. That's not what it's for. Versus L2 is where the user experience is, right? L2 is fast and cheap, and it batches everything up such that we can make batch transactions to L1. I think we're kind of in the same spot today, where it's like with chain abstraction and with intents, we can decouple the like things that we really need, like security, from things that we want and things that users need, like user experience.
Yeah, that's very well said. I think this also reminds me of like a spaces we did, I think with Celestia and Zaki last time, where we were talking about what's the right abstraction to be at, right? And what we kind of like realized was it's a fine balance where you have to abstract away the right things, but also expose the right things for users or developers to be able to kind of like still have control over what they like want to. So yeah, I think overall, just to kind of like summarize what you all said, right? I think like it all boils down to making crypto much more usable, right? Or making the UX really really awesome, right? But I think what people kind of like also lack is just this visualization of how this kind of like looks like, right? So for example, in a intent centric application, if I go there, what does a declarative UX really look like, right? So maybe Grant, Kevin, whoever wants to go first, maybe you can just help visualize what does this application, like what does an intent application look like, how does the user experience really feel like for the user going onto an application like that.
Yeah, I can go. I think it will be very different from the form factors. Could be very different from today, right? Because again, what intent would enable is very declarative based interaction, right? So it tells user what allow you to express what they want and then what the outcome they want to produce, and then the execution is just automatic, right? I would even say it will probably be like sci-fi, what people consider sci-fi today, right? So it could be just, you have a wearable device, a bike, and just say, hey, get me some Bitcoin today. It's a pumping, get me some Bitcoin. And then, there could be some LLMs that trained, and then obviously they're not just carry out execution, but we'll have a conversation. It could be a chatbot. It could be, yeah, there you go, GPT-4o, her, right? uh, and we'll just confirm, hey, is this really what you want? Just to confirm you want this and this. If you say confirm, then I'll do it, right? And then it'll just do it for you. And then the execution itself, you just don't worry about anything. Obviously, it can be different form factors like a chatbot, like a chat room. It can be individualized. It can be presented as UI. I think what intent to enable is sort of this bring back this aggregation theory in Web2, that we have too many services, and it just you are not able to decide what's best for them. Something like TripAdvisor would aggregate different airlines, hotels, and experiences providers and whatnot, and then sort of curate that marketplace to bring these services better to users, and then they can select only the ones they see will be good for the user, and they help the user construct the transaction to interact with these vendors, right? I mean, this is what we see for intents. Basically, introduce this middle sort of intermediary that can help users to get what they want, and then that intermediary that we call solvers is indefinitely sort of customizable, right? And everybody can be that curator, executor, transmitter, right? Anybody can be that role, and then to facilitate that experience, I can curate different risk, execution, and chain security. Everything can be curated. That's sort of, I think, the end game.
I was just going to say I largely agree with that. I think that one of the biggest unlocks that declarative architecture introduces is this ability for a user to convert an intent, or even the backend to convert an intent in the form of like plain text, or as Kevin was saying, even through like an LLM or agent or something, into something that a solver can easily digest and then provide a solution on. For so many people, myself included, like the ability to just like very easily say like, oh my God, fucking this shit coin is about to rip. I want to buy it right now. And then just like very quickly do that would be a huge unlock. And one of the biggest things I think that we've seen in terms of like hindering adoption is that many users who are still either hesitant or have been like abrased by trying to do anything on chain, is that there's still so many like various interfaces that they have to go through initially before they can even do anything. So just like declarative architecture kind of like can simplify the number of spaces that a user would need to go to before actually performing an on. So instead of like potentially having to jump into a wallet to verify like contents, make sure they're on the right chain, or I guess like I'm not really abstraction here, but if the user has to jump between like 3 or 4 different interfaces as opposed to next screen and saying like, okay, this chart looks good, and then using a simple interface to say like buy 1 ETH worth of contracted gas, or even just like a ticker. That's like just a huge improvement in terms of user experience for how someone, even a new user, would be able to be onboarded to a chain. Yeah.
Can I kind of like chime in and ask a quick question? Like we have like two of the most kind of like base intent people here. I find it like pretty challenging to kind of like think about like how to express as a developer, how to think about constraints, and like how to kind of like make sure the right constraints are built into the application and stuff like that. Maybe like a good analogy is like, why is there no intent-based Tinder yet? Right? Like,
Tinder
I mean,
is an intent-based system.
If you want to build that on the
me.
schedule, I'll write you a grant for it.
Yeah, like how do me as like a Tinder user, which I'm not, express?
Sure, you're not.
How do I express my constraints? Right?
I think so. Put it this way. I think. Oh, go ahead.
No. Please, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was gonna say, for any app, as long as you see a search button, there's the intent. That's the intent, right? Because almost by definition, you have to tell them what to search. So that's a constraint. You only want to see the things that match your search. Maybe they have other sort of checkboxes to help you define your search, and they probably allow you to present the results in a way that makes like more relevant things to you upfront. So that there is intent-centric, right? So you allow you to say what they want, and then you don't have to know how they got these results for you, and then they allow you to, or they assume your preferences, what you want to see first, and so that's basically we talk about constraints, preferences, predicates, and all that. It's just that's the way I see it. So I think Tinder is definitely it's definitely intent-centric.
I think a lot of this as well comes down to like specialized solvers. So generally, like if you are trying to submit an intent and accomplish something on chain, you are submitting that intent and it's going to a wide range of solvers. But like not every solver is going to efficiently solve the same problems. So that's where you get into projects like Enso, which are more focused on building solvers around specific problems that could happen on chain. So in this case, using Tinder as an example, there would be a solver out there that is specifically focused around matchmaking. and taking in user constraints and saying like, oh, I don't want to reveal my dating preferences live right now. I'm not going to do that. But if you as a user say like, hey, I am looking for X, Y, Z in a potential partner, then that solver is going to look at all of their both like on-chain available data sources and as well as like a bunch of off-chain data sources to say, like, okay, I have a user who wants X, Y, Z, and that coincides with this other user or person I have that wants X, Y, Z, or maybe just X, Y, and then like there's a range on that on a constraint that's like an acceptable outcome. So you could have a user saying like, I'm looking for something between 4 feet and 8 feet tall, and that range, as long as the constraint falls within that range of like acceptable outcomes, then the solver would know like, okay, this would work for user A and user B. So you can think of constraints as basically just like a range of acceptable outcomes on users' intent.
Yeah, I might take you up on that grant offer just for research purposes. It actually sounds like an intent-based tender would be like more efficient than the current one. Sorry, Arjun, go for
it. Stocker is going to pivot into building an AI matchmaker.
Why do you even need an AI matchmaker when you can just date the AI, right?
That's a good question. Or have your AI date their AI.
That's what Bumble is doing, I think.
That's what Bumble said they want to do.
Very dystopian. I love it.
I will say, so obviously this is super like it's awesome to talk about this because it is, I think, the definition of what an application means is going to change really significantly. And I don't just mean this for crypto, right? But I mean this more broadly, like the way that we think about interacting with the web or interacting with the world is changing really rapidly. But I think even if you don't consider that for like an existing application, like Uniswap, for instance, or Aave, simply introducing intents into the background means that you can just really, really dramatically change the way that you think about the application today. Where like today it's like you're interacting with Aave, you have to like do this experience that you go through right now, where you're like, okay, I go and like I find a pool that I want to deposit into with the money that I have, and then I go and like click the button, and then it connects my wallet, and then I have to make sure that's on the right chain, and then I have to approve a transaction, and like even just that, even on a single chain, just that experience today is like still just baffling, right? It's just not how people want to use things. We believe that this is how people want to use things because we're crazy people that have been in and like have complete warped sense of what it means to have good user experience. But like just taking an app like Aave and turning it into something where it's like I can just say I want to deposit, just let me deposit my USDC and get the best return. That's it, right? If that's what I care about, I can just specify this is what I want. Automatically, it's just a much simpler and better experience.
That's I think like very similar to how Astaria is approaching lending on their platform, and they're one that I'm quite a big fan of because it's not necessarily like a completely simplified interface yet, where you can just like say I'm depositing this and I want this return. But that's like definitely something that they're getting to. I think also with something like Aave, as a user, like the more complex the application, ultimately the more complex the person using it has to be, and the more they have to understand the financial tool that they're interacting with. So if you, as like a new user to DeFi, if you're not necessarily like the most financially astute person, you now need to go understand like LTV, basically like the collateral ratio, like everything there. And so like being faced with that interface as a new user in DeFi is like very overwhelming. And so it's much easier to express it, as you're saying, that a user just be like, I want to lend out my ETH. And then the solver can say like, okay, this is the most optimal outcome in terms of like yield that you would get on lending your ETH. And like that's like way better for new users and also for experienced DeFi users, people who just like want to accomplish something quickly.
as a final note, it also makes the interfaces for all these apps so much more interesting, right? So like, say for example, you're building a DeFi protocol that is getting integrated by like, an aggregator interface, something like Zapper, versus something like Robinhood, versus like a DEX aggregator, versus some other like basically other systems down the line, like potentially, for example, a game that is using Uniswap under the hood to do their like in-game marketplace. One of the interesting challenges that exist today is that for every different kind of integration that happens, like Uniswap will, for example, distribute like a certain, like their kind of core interface for how users interact with the application. But every new kind of integration you do has to have a new kind of supporting infrastructure to actually be able to like work with the system. Whereas in a declarative or intent-based paradigm, you don't need to do that. It doesn't matter what you're building on top of the thing. You could just, this now has an interface that is just, you could basically just go and talk to it and say, hey, I don't really care how any of this works. Just like help me find the best trade. That's it. And I think that I'm like really, one thing I'm super excited about is the way that that's going to accelerate composability in the space. Like I don't think we're ready today. Like we talk about composability being such an important part of like what makes crypto possible. But like imagine a world where you can get composability just by talking to an app and telling the app like, hey, figure out how best to like integrate with this thing. And you know that when it integrates with the thing, like that's going to happen in a way where you're not taking on added security risk. You're not worried about like contract hacks or anything like that. I think that like the DeFi Lego is really becoming incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I think the interesting bit is, yes, it kind of like increases composability when you look at it from that perspective. But I think what ends up happening is like intent-based systems have like their off-chain entities, and it's very hard to kind of like merge those two together. So it also kind of like breaks composability when that sort of thing happens. And hopefully, like the MOPA stuff kind of like help like come back together. So in a lot of ways, I think intent and chain abstraction are kind of like siblings, where both of them feed into each other in a lot of ways. Um, for example, like if you really want to build like a really good experience, what that would actually look like is you would go to an app and you would be seeing like this like global balance, and this balance or the assets here would actually be fragmented on chain. Like all of us have a fragmented on-chain balances where you have 100 USDC on Polygon, you have 100 USDC on Arbitrum, you have 100 USDC on Arbitrum, Optimism, and now you want to kind of like buy the slots that's worth like 300 USDC. But now you need to figure out like how to swap 3 times, how to bridge 3 times before you can actually kind of like buy that thing. So what chain abstraction would do is kind of like allow you to give to an intent your complete balance, and that intent would kind of like your chain abstracted balance in like the most efficient form. So it's kind of like chain abstraction feeds into the intent protocol and the vice versa. This is something I'm still kind of like trying to kind of like picture and kind of like have like a little mental framework, but I think like both of these technologies are kind of like siblings.
There was I was just going to say that there was one other thing I wanted to add on like the current state of kind of like without looking at like advanced transfer protocols, is that for a user, like a new user to DeFi who isn't even necessarily aware of those things, like for that user to operate in a cross-chain like environment where they're having to balance like multiple chains at any given time, they're also having to worry about confirmation times on those bridges. So like even using something like Wi-Fi, a user is still having to wait like 10, 20, 30 minutes for those cross-chain swaps to occur. And it's just increasing the number of clicks that a user has to worry about for, I say Li-Fi as an example, but like I think this is true for a lot of cross-chain tools, and also just like bridging in general. But the longer a user has to wait for something they want to accomplish to even be accomplished, or even like a step for them to move forward in achieving their end goal, like that's going to invariably like turn off a user from even wanting to interact with that system. So I think like in a way, moving forward with intents and chain abstraction, like reducing the actual amount of time a user has to worry about how long it's going to take them to accomplish something is like another like huge step forward in terms of UX, like on-chain UX. These people don't want to have to sit there for like an hour or two waiting for like multiple bridges to happen so that they can do like some kind of arbitrage or like get into a new coin on a chain that they're interested in, or like start gambling somewhere. They just want to like jump immediately in there.
Yeah, I think sort of another angle, everybody talk about users, right? I think another angle that maybe we haven't talked too much here is developers. Today, a developer want to build an app. The very first question is which chain I'm going to be building on. And then that's a hard question. You pick the wrong one, well, it has consequences, right? And then and maybe the second question is which other chain I should be moving to, right? I should also deploy my app to. And that's just a huge headache. And it shouldn't be like that. It's very path dependent, sort of how we got here, the technology is available to them, and so on. So whether we talk about intent or chain abstraction, there's also a developer point of view. Like, how can we abstract chains away from developers? So it doesn't matter where you deploy. You can own your user experience so that you can work with users from anywhere. You can work with other protocols on other chains from any other chains, and then you can work with assets from any other chains. And that sort of developer experience or developer primitives that they can use, it is not available today. And I think this will change, right? And Web2 is an example. The early days, I think people build with hard code their apps with specific ISPs. That's analogous to deploy your app on the chain, but nobody does that anymore, right? You just let's say you have ENS name, that's what you own, and then everything else just go from there, right? And whether it's working with other chains, whether it's working with even like semi-centralized solution providers, right? So you can program your bigger protocol relying other solvers or agents to bring you the solution to you instead of internalize everything yourself. And that's what's the paradigm today. And people have to decide. Well, I guess after they decide which chain you want to build in, the second thing they have to decide is which interop protocol I have to internalize and hard code with so that I can go to like this 5 other chains, right? You have this, I think maybe like about 2 years ago, there was the height of omni-chain applications where you have to sort of hard code it with certain interop protocols as well. And that's just become a huge headache. Your vendor logged in, they can extract you if they want to, charge more fees, and so on. It's a big headache. I think, whether you talk about intent or chain abstraction as well.
Awesome. So looks like we're kind of like heading into this completely new paradigm where infra will or is almost going to be ready finally for applications, for developers to build crazy applications that resemble a lot like Tinder, for example, or Uber, and the users are also ready to kind of like finally use something like that with kind of like the blockchain and the magic of decentralization at the back end, right? I think since we're short on time, I think like one final question before we conclude, right? I think while we've talked about intents and chain abstraction and like all of these like off-chain agents and everything like that, right? I'm very curious to know how does like these concepts interact with other parts of the stack. So for example, Kevin, you mentioned about gas abstraction, right? Like account abstraction is kind of like this huge thing that has been out there to kind of like solve this exact problem, make users to kind of like hold their keys and stuff like that. How does intents interact, or what's the relationship between intents and account abstraction? What's the relationship between chain abstraction and account abstraction, right? Because this is again a very widely misunderstood sort of a problem.
Yeah, I can sort of lean here a little bit, right? The way we see it is intent fundamentally it's just sort of off-chain solution generation, on-chain settlement sort of paradigm, right? And then all the specific use cases, gas abstraction, for example, account abstraction, all these are just specific instance of such paradigm. And with Khalani, they can be composable, right? So you can compose both the settlement and you can also compose the generation. You can compose on-chain and you can compose off-chain. Then they no longer become sort of separate protocols, right? They become this sort of coherent and then mendable sort of tools. You can curate the interaction that is both gas abstracted, that's both account abstracted, balance abstracted, chain abstracted, execution abstracted, optimization abstracted, pricing abstracted. Everything can be extracted from you, right? As long as you have the right sort of solvers that can carry out the abstraction, optimization, execution, and cross-chain for you, right? You can define all that together and present a very high-level sort of mandate from the users and say, here's what you want, right? If you want, then let's do it. So that becomes sort of the magic experience.
Yeah, can quickly kind of like chime in here. Like the way I see it is like, as I mentioned before, like I think I just look at these things like access control. I know Kevin doesn't agree with this, but broadly speaking, I feel like intents are the most flexible access control method, where you don't have to like specify exactly how this thing gets executed, but you still have control via the preferences or via the constraints, right? So it's one way a user can authenticate an off-chain actor to do something. It's the most flexible way. Then comes like things like user op from the account abstraction standpoint, where you still kind of like let the off-chain actors have some flexibility on how this thing gets executed on-chain, who pays for gas, when to kind of like speed it up, when to cancel, stuff like that. But you as a user are still kind of like uh, giving the exact instructions that need to be executed on-chain. This off-chain actors cannot fuck around. The last one is like transactions, which is like super rigid, where you hard code exact instructions, exactly how it needs to be executed on chain, and that's why it's like so hard to work with in like this like chain abstraction setting. So I think like intents and chain abstraction, as I mentioned before, go very well together yeah, because like intents are very flexible. But I think with user ops too, we can design like similar experiences. So chain abstraction can ingest both transactions, user ops, as well as intents, and kind of like offer that same experience. At least like that's how I look at it. It's all about access control and how users delegate access to their funds, access to their on-chain interactions to these off-chain actors.
Grant, Arjun, you guys want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my side, just like I think the points that I would have shared would have been quite similar. That like there's just this like broader umbrella of problems associated with user experience today that are all solved by offloading complexity from the user over to some service provider that can go and take care of that on behalf of the user. Those problems include stuff like moving across chains. They include stuff like making a transaction in the first place. They include stuff like paying gas. So like when you look at like intent solvers, you look at like meta transaction layers, you look at paymasters for 4337, right? These are all literally the same thing. They're kind of doing the same task, and we've just kind of independently in each vertical we've come to the same conclusion, which is a really good sign. That just means that we're like on the right track. I think more generally, I noticed also there was kind of a question around like how do solvers work? How do you ensure that they remain beholden to the rule set? So like I think the specific question was, how does the solver work in the case of take my BTC for max yield? Can't the solver just take an asset and never return it? And I think for all of these, like regardless of whether you're talking about like cross-chain intents, you're talking about like account abstraction intents, whatever, for all of them, there's the same kind of core model, which is that the solver, the person that is providing the service, does all of it themselves, right? They're providing the service using their own funds. They're providing the service using their own capital, their own stake, whatever it is that they need to provide, their own gas money. And they only get repaid after the fact. And I think this is part of why it's so helpful to think about all of these different categories as a single thing, because like effectively there's no reason why a meta transaction relayer couldn't also just hold inventory and like relay cross-chain transactions and be like a cross-chain intent solver, and the security model would look almost exactly the same. Like it would just be for the specific case that you mentioned, right? Like the meta transaction relayer would give their own BTC and deposit into a pool that they think is going to get max yield, and then they would go and prove that to you as the user and to the source chain, and then the source chain would give them back. It would basically repay them BTC plus gas and whatever.
Yeah, I think I would. Yeah, I guess my response to this is very similar to what everyone else has said. In the case of the audience question around like Bitcoin and the solver just like taking it and never returning it, there are. I mean, this is solvers going off and performing like actions that like a solver just like stealing user funds or something like that. It's something that I mean, ultimately solvers are not incentivized to really do anything like that because they usually are like docs individuals and entities that are known. Like generally it would be like a legally incorporated person or something. I see Kevin shaking his head at me. But it's not necessarily like these solvers are completely like anonymous individuals that are just being granted user funds or taking their own funds and performing these actions. Like if a solver did decide to take a bunch of user deposits and fuck off to Bali or something, like that's a bridge we can cross when we get there, but I feel like it's not necessarily a huge risk at this time. I could be completely wrong, but I don't foresee that happening based on the conversations that I've had, with a bunch of solvers in the space.
I think like if the Khalani thesis and the Connext thesis are correct, like our goal is to work towards opening up solving for really everybody, to the point where you can have hundreds of thousands, because like how do you get solvers to solve for like more obscure use cases? You need more people doing more custom shit and earning money from it. And so if that thesis is true, then I think we can't. I don't know if we could rely on an outcome where it's like we could explicitly penalize solvers because, or like in some way socially discourage or like go after them or anything like that. But I do think like there is ways to like these systems can and especially so I think that the reason why there's sometimes confusion here is that like people mostly think about solvers today as like these single chain systems where you don't actually have this risk at all, right? Like the solver like does a thing on chain, but they do the thing and they get repaid. They settle in the same block, and so there's no possibility for the solver to ever steal funds because like they're like usually just like flash minting funds and then repaying them in the same block or something like that. It's really only like across chains that you have this concern and like this risk, and for the cross chain piece there is at least a way to constrain that risk, which is that it sounds stupid, but literally just the solver just doesn't get the money until after they fill the intent. So like if they don't fill the intent correctly, they have spent a bunch of their own money to do something and they're not getting repaid. So at that point, there's like no incentive for them to cheat.
Yeah, I think what you really want to do with these systems is kind of like design them in an atomic fashion. I think there is like a good amount of confusion in this space where like one transaction means atomic, otherwise it's not. But actually, atomicity is like something on the application level, and that's what like a bunch of like cross-chain intent protocols are doing, right? Kind of like designing atomicity on the application level such that even if the interaction is async, user has atomic outcomes, right? And like we can kind of like figure this out for any sort of application. It needs a bunch of like thinking, but I think like you can kind of like design the stuff and make it atomic on the application layer, and use intents to kind of like do this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, I definitely think solver should be decentralized and should be open access and should be even anonymous, right? So we shouldn't have to rely on the identity of solver to guarantee security and user funds and whatnot. I mean, the way I look at it is basically we're moving a lot of the complexity to off-chain by embracing intent-centric paradigm and chain abstraction, and to the point that we want solver to be smarter and smarter, right? And we kind of want blockchain to be dumber and dumber because blockchains are expensive. Global consensus is very expensive, and they're also limiting because once you're on chain, you only have access to the state, whereas this entire world that's outside you just don't have access to. By empowering off-chain agents, aka solvers, you get access to, better pricing, latency, and any information that they have access to. The solution can be built from that, right? So I think it's a strictly better solution. And then dumber blockchain just means blockchain is going to be this commitment device, and then proof device, right? So the pattern you interact with blockchain is basically user make a commitment, say, hey, with my funds, I want something to be done, right? And then I don't care who does this for me. And then some solver just go out and do this for the user. And as long as you can prove to me that this is done, then you can get my money. So it's basically commitment and proof device. That's the fundamental root of cryptography, and the best way to use global consensus. Now, in that paradigm, the problem is as you push complexity into the off-chain space, you're really putting a lot of requirement to solve it, to be very smart, to be very expressive, to handle everything. And that's really the hard part of this paradigm to materialize. And then, the way the Khalani vision is that we add this new primitive to say it's not just users and sort of commit to a blockchain, and solvers sort of bring proofs and then settle. But solver and solver, between two different off-chain agents, they can also commit and prove between each other, and that's it. That's the missing primitive that I think that's in the industry. So if we have that, then solver collaboration can become decentralized and trustless. Then you can do like all the programmability and just like smart contract compatibility. You can have really expressive solver that can pretty much do everything. If you miss something, you build something, you add something to it. So that's the way I see it.
I want to add and clarify as well that I'm not advocating for like small centralized sets of known entity solvers. I don't think that's the future. I am very optimistic around like large sets of decentralized solvers, because that also has like the second order effects of more competitive pricing for users, which will ultimately bring costs down when it comes to like submitting and completing intents or like cross-chain actions.